Try now. I just switched microphones. Does that work? Yes. Okay, here we go. Is there a way to get participants to be visible on the screen so I can see who you are and say hello? Sorry for all of the hitches here. I apologize. It all worked just great the other day. Let's get started. I'm Pam Cooper White. I'm the Dean and Professor of Psychology and Religion at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And I'm delighted to be a part of this event, which I just can't thank LaKesha enough for all of the work that she's done and her team. It's a fabulous event. My topic has to do with work that I've been doing for almost 40 years in the area of advocacy for battered women and their children, but expanded also to working to end violence against women and LGBTQ persons. Intimate partner violence has been particularly my emphasis over many years. Back in 1985, I published a book called The Cry of Tamar, Violence Against Women and the Church's Response, which came out in a second edition in 2012. And then very recently, another book called Gender, Violence, and Justice, which has to do with a whole series of collected essays over many years around advocacy for justice against gender-based violence. So I'd like to present for a bit and then elicit any questions that any of you might have or comments. And please do feel free also to put your questions and comments in the chat as we go along. So after 40 years of work, new understandings of gender and violence against women have emerged. And we've witnessed perhaps an unprecedented rise in women publicly calling men to account for sexual harassment and abuse, while at the same time we continue to elevate perpetrators to high office in both church and state. And I'm sure that some of you would have examples of that in your own situations. Many repeat offenders lie low for a while and then reemerge to resume their careers with very little public outcry, memory, or even awareness of their former malfeasance by simply trading one arena of work for another and carrying on as usual. In 2016, we, including 52% of white women, elected Donald Trump, a racist perpetrator-in-chief, whose abusive attitudes and treatment of women, public and evidence would strongly suggest private, are well known and yet appear to be overlooked and tolerated by large swaths of the general population. And in work I'm doing currently on a new book on Christian nationalism, the psychology of Christian nationalism, I also learned that 81% of evangelical Christians voted for Trump in the 2016 election. Like most perpetrators, Trump's violent words and behavior were minimized or denied, often with outright lies, both by himself and by those who choose to protect him. And his violent words gave tacit and sometimes more than tacit permission for Americans who had learned to stifle, perhaps, their own hate speech in recent decades to come out with a vengeance. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which tracks extremist hate groups of all kinds, has documented masculinist, white supremacist groups in the US who also incorporate anti-woman, heterosexist hate speech on their websites. SPLC views these gateways to larger racist white supremacist groups who also foster anti-woman and anti-LGBTQ hate crime activity. Often, I'm sad to say, cloaked by Christian groups, especially Christian nationalists, in the symbols and beliefs of evangelical Christianity, as we saw at its most extreme in the insurrection on the US Capitol on January 6th. Closely entwined with these social and political upheavals, and doubtless motivated by them, a fresh wave of outrage has erupted against this hate. The Women's March on Washington, immediately following the Trump inauguration in 2016, brought new urgency to progressive activism. 2017. The Me Too movement, already founded years before by Black activist Tarana Burke, suddenly gained significant traction when it was enlisted by white women celebrities in exposing men's sexual harassment and abuse, first in Hollywood and now increasingly in many other high-profile professional settings, including journalism, finance, athletics, and the tech industry. Among the millennial generation, the word feminist has begun to emerge from under the cloud of conservative scorn that it cowered for some years. But the whitening of these movements as white celebrity women have taken the spotlight has once again left women of color and working class and poor women out of the equation. The word post-racial has been retired from use following the end of the Obama presidency in the wake of a rise of institutionalized and socially condoned racist violence. And the mask of white complacency is being ripped away by increasingly public revelations of racist violence that is not new, as we all know. The non-indictment of Breonna Taylor's murderer, and the cold-blooded murder of George Floyd that we have all witnessed again and again on video in the news are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to racist violence. And as you can imagine, in the Black community, many, many, many names are well known, less well known in the white community. And that's a tragedy. Shocking to all of us here at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, this violence, anti-Black violence, literally came home to our campus with the discovery of a noose hung in a utility closet on the roof. We've been reeling in shock and dismay and anger. White supremacist backlash has been in the ascendancy during the Trump administration, but it has by no means gone away. It may also be well to remember that much of the abuse and exploitation of women committed by men in the so-called liberal era of the 60s and 70s was done explicitly in the name of sexual liberation and progressive social change, especially in the more typically liberal contexts such as the arts and among activist communities. And this strategy of psychological coercion has been employed by clergy within religious institutions and communities just as much as in secular contexts. Christian churches have put policies in place in the 1980s and 90s to curb sexual misconduct by clergy and religious leaders, yet many still struggle to justly address the epidemic of child sexual abuse, especially in the Catholic Church, and still fail to fully enforce existing policies against adult-to-adult sexual harassment, abuse, and exploitation. Clergy are still moved around from parish to parish and district to district after cursory suspensions for supposed rehabilitation, and those who are permanently moved from ministry often find their way into allied professions such as counseling and social work. The complex issue of so-called identity politics, another term now deemed pejorative by the right, is valid and important, but it can also be twisted against progressive movements for justice as the machinery of divide and conquer poisons the capacity of those of us who want to be advocates to build alliances across oppressions. We're challenged to find common ground, to build effective coalitions for change without appearing to make sexism, racism, heterosexism, and other forms of oppression equivalent, or to be subsumed one within the other, to essentialize or conflate them. We need to recover the intersections among sexism across all ethnicities and racism across all genders, which in my experience were more prominent in the original movement to end violence against women and even integral to staff training than the anti-racism movement is in the movement to end violence against women today. Even the most radical white feminists today still struggle to recognize and combat our own racism. And churches, including the Black church, remain bastions of patriarchal privilege, even while mobilizing for other forms of social justice and equality. We are living indeed in a post-traumatic time and a post-traumatic culture. I would even say still traumatic time and traumatic culture. in which the increasing divide of wealth and power has not only built upon a legacy of past violence, including the original sins of chattel slavery, the genocide of Native American peoples, and the routine oppression of women across the centuries. These constitute traumas that urgently require the healing of North American culture. But we're also living in a time of publicly tolerated violence that maintains an atmosphere of ongoing trauma, including gender-based violence and racism. It's very difficult to heal from trauma while trauma is still happening. Gender itself is emerging as an important challenge for the future of the movement to end violence against women. On the one hand, the male-female binary is being challenged and broken down by trans non-binary gender activists who are protesting being boxed into stereotypical masculine versus feminine identities. And they are seeking to embody an identity that is free to incorporate or discard elements of both traditional feminine and masculine symbolism and other forms of identity. This has engendered, pun intended, fierce debates within the LGBTQ community about the authenticity of identities. For example, now traditional butch lesbian, transgender man, or queer non-binary gender. Is trans a gender swap or something less traditionally defined? An identity that transcends the binary and eschews all traditional gender norms, including the way those norms are encoded in language, for example, the use of masculine and feminine pronouns. Trans persons have been the targets of hate violence equal to or perhaps even greater than violence toward gays and lesbians. The rates of suicide, especially in adolescence and young adulthood, are disproportionately high. In some estimates, even 40% of those who identify as trans. I see the issue of gender as it has come under scrutiny, particularly among millennials and academics versed in gender theory, as a thickly entwined reality of subjugation of both cis women, that is, women who identify as women, and LGBTQ persons. In part, the term intimate partner violence has increasingly replaced the terms domestic violence and woman battering in recognition that violence occurs among multiple gender configurations, though still between 89 and 95% of domestic violence is male to female. Without diminishing the particularities of violence targeting women and targeting persons who do not conform in one way or another to stereotypical gender norms, I recognize here that there's a common attack on what I would call the non-masculine, and on anyone who embodies a challenge to the patriarchal structure of mostly white men at the top of the power pyramid. The patriarchal preoccupation with being on top in every way possible assigns both women and non-gender conforming persons to roles of subordination. Race and class privilege further complicate the debate, as race and class identities and issues can be recruited in fighting against gender reform. At the same time, the meme of toxic masculinity, originally born out of the, I would say in many ways problematic, mythopoetic men's movement of the 1980s, has on the one hand promoted healthy masculinity as a way to mitigate the destructive impact of masculinity on men, and has also created pockets of advocacy for non-stereotyping parenting and relationships among men that have a non-violent, pro-feminist agenda. Black feminist activist Bell Hooks has written a compelling argument for men becoming more relational as a way to combat both violence against women and harm toward other men and themselves. But as Michael Kimmel argues, turning around, quote, aggrieved entitlement will take more than persuasion that men feeling and expressing their feelings is a better way to live. The appeal to individual self-interest is not enough to overcome the gravity of the social construction of traditional gender norms and their attendant rationalizations for male privilege and violence. The men's rights movement, a strong manifestation of masculinist backlash against feminist claims, feeds on cultural narratives of men's victimization and emasculation and stokes the fires of violence against women. It's important to remark that not all men are abusers of women. In a statistical category error, it's been assumed that if roughly a quarter to a third of all women are victims of intimate partner violence, the same proportion of men are perpetrators, but that's actually a statistical error. With the reality of pattern offenders who continue to offend, leaving multiple victims in their wake, it can probably be said with some confidence that a smaller percentage of individual men is responsible for the larger percentage of victims. And this is a specific statistic that we don't have. At the same time, the socialization of men to violence against both men and women is a dynamic in all relationships within a patriarchal society. And patriarchal patterns of dominance and submission require recognition and reform in all contexts and among all gender identities. Men in particular need to own up to the ways in which masculinist socialization has been harmful to themselves and others, and to do the men's work of confronting violence against women and LGBTQ persons, especially among their peers in interpersonal situations. One last word. I want to say something about the impact of COVID on intimate partner violence. I'm sure that those who are working in direct service and advocacy for survivors of intimate partner violence can attest that the pandemic has wrought even more terror and suffering for victims and for children in the home. Isolation is one of the known tactics of abusers, and the pandemic, with its lockdown requirements, has only exacerbated the isolation that allows violence to continue in secret, with victims trapped due to COVID restrictions and unable to escape. The pandemic also caused severe problems for battered women's agencies, both in terms of observing the health protocols there in the shelters, reducing the number of available beds, and also preventing workers from being on site, as well as COVID-related reductions in funding and volunteer support. Some reports, based on calls to 9/11, have suggested that public assaults, burglaries, and minor crimes committed by groups are down. Systematic data is actually lacking and somewhat contradictory there. But public assaults, burglaries, minor crimes by groups are down, whereas sexual assault, especially in the home, and intimate partner violence has increased, as have shootings and homicides. And it's estimated that half or more of so-called domestic attacks are never reported to police for legitimate fears: fear of the abuser, fear of the police due to racist policing, fear that their partner might be mistreated or even killed by the police, fear among immigrants and refugees of being deported, and or fear that nothing will happen, putting their children and themselves in greater danger. I have the utmost respect for colleagues who do their best in spite of this pandemic of violence within the COVID pandemic to advocate for victims and survivors, to work with men to stop violence, and to educate congregations and the public about the dynamics of gender-based violence. It's my hope that in my writings and advocacy over many years, I've been able to assert an uncompromising stance for gender justice while recognizing the complexities of human personalities and relationships, and the numerous socially constructed constraints that we internalize and that hold us bound. As a therapist, I want to explore the depths of individuals' complexity and multiplicity of self-states, including self-blame, revenge, claiming of agency and empowerment, healing and growth through suffering without excusing or wishing it away. And my colleague at Union, Ann Colley, just did a wonderful presentation in the last hour on the importance of mental health and counseling for all those who are in our midst in congregations. As a feminist therapist, in great alliance with womanist theology, I also want to work toward the empowerment of women and other persons targeted for oppression, keeping the larger societal issues of injustice always in view as a factor, both political and psychological, that we all have internalized, both consciously and unconsciously, and which we need to remember and to contest. We know that we internalize the messages of sexism, racism, and homophobia, and ableism, and all kinds of other oppressions within ourselves. And we even tell those messages to ourselves when we ourselves are the targets of those oppressions. Our clinical training and wisdom should not erase from our awareness that violence is wrong, period, regardless of anyone's internal motivations. No one deserves violence, no matter what, and there are no psychological excuses for perpetrators to commit violence. Neither relational conflict nor the dynamics of a perpetrator's unconscious personal history or childhood abuse of the perpetrator are a valid excuse or get out of jail free card for terrorizing another human being. There are lines that simply must not be crossed. And from a theological point of view, the prophetic balancing act of the prophet Micah, holding kindness, justice, and humility together, must take precedence over a watered-down Christianity of self-absorbed niceness and cheap grace. So I want to end there and ask, are there questions or comments that you'd like to share in the chat? Perhaps some of your own experiences that could help to flesh out some of this. Question in the chat, what are some ways that the church can help with battered families? Fortunately, this is something that we have been working on for a long time. Early in the 70s and 80s, there was a lot of suspicion between churches and battered women's shelters. Churches were afraid that the workers in battered women's shelters would be taking people away from the faith. People in battered women's shelters were afraid of traditional messages that many pastors did tell battered women, such as just pray harder and your perpetrator will be fine and he'll do better, or just go home and try to be a good Christian wife and you'll see things improve. Those messages are actually dangerous because the traditional batterer does not respond to the woman trying harder. The issue of battering is about power and control, not about a perfect relationship. However, churches have gotten a lot more savvy, and I want to do a shout out to Marie Fortune of sorry, I'm forgetting the name of it. It used to have another name. You can look up Marie Fortune, Faith Trust Institute, sorry. They have numerous resources that can be used in congregations, including training materials, but also some simple things can be done. For example, if you're a church leader, pastor or lay leader or a counselor in the church, linking up with the battered women's organizations, the anti-gay violence organizations in your communities, finding out who the advocates are, and perhaps invite them to come and do a workshop at your church. Or another thing that they can do is provide you with resource and hotline materials. Many places, those materials are posted on the inside of the doors of women's rooms in the bathrooms so that they can write down those phone numbers and call when it's safe to do so. One caveat is that pastors should not try to counsel the perpetrator because it could be a betrayal of the victim's confidentiality and could also just result in a retaliatory attack on her by the perpetrator. So those of us who work in battered women's organizations are the ones who have specific training to do this kind of work. Pastors do not have that particular kind of training. So it's a question of partnership and networking with people in the community. And I would say that is the number one most important thing, is to overcome barriers of trust between the so-called sacred and secular, and to reach out to those in the community who are able to provide shelter, support, and safety for victims. LaKesha, did that answer your question? Okay. Some signs that someone might be struggling with abuse include not talking about their relationship very much or talking about it in a very evasive way. If you see the couple together, you might see, and this goes for not just male-female couples, but for all couples where violence is going on, you might see that someone is continually deferential toward the other partner, maybe even taking a quick look and checking with the partner before expressing an opinion. This is particularly important in same-sex relationships where it's often an accusation of so-called mutual battering and mutual violence. And it is true that in many relationships, the victim may try to fight back, even physically, but that doesn't mean that they are any less the victim, because domestic violence is not just about an act of violence, but it's about a surrounding pattern of power and control of one person over another. Obviously, if you see bruises, if you see people flinch, those kinds of reactions might involve your wanting to say, how are you doing? Are you doing okay? But be careful, because other than referring to experts who know how to deal with safety issues, you can, by intruding, actually do more harm than good. And especially in the Black community and communities of color, where police cannot be trusted to do the right thing, calling the police or reporting the adult-to-adult abuse can actually make things much worse. So it's important to gain the trust of the person that you are concerned about and allow them on their own time to tell you what's going on and then provide referrals. You can also say, I'm very concerned. If you've heard a disclosure, I'm very concerned about you, because what I've learned is that these things don't get better over time. In fact, they almost always get worse, and you could be in great danger. Are there some other questions? Very often a person doesn't want to report or get help, and one of the things we have to do in that instance is deal with our own self-care and our own feelings of frustration, because no one besides the victim has a better gauge on what's safe for them than they have themselves. If we try to push things, if we try to argue them into doing something for themselves, you'll simply raise resistances and get nowhere. You may even create a rupture of trust in the relationship that you've had. So I always express things in terms of concern, but I never want to give the person the impression that if they don't do what I think they should do, that I will disapprove, because then they may not come back to me if what I suggested that they do backfired, which it can. So I always express concern. I give people information. So that's an empowerment-based way of approaching this. You can show them things. You can talk about the cycle of violence, which isn't as common as people think, but often there is a kind of an escalation and then a blow up and then a honeymoon period where the perpetrator is all apology and hearts and flowers. That tends to diminish over time, but you can let people know that apologies are not necessarily going to change the likelihood that violence will continue. And you can also talk to them about, there are graphics that are out there all over the internet. You can find it, the power and control wheel, that shows the ways in which violence is just one aspect of power and control in the relationship. There are all kinds of other ways in which batterers isolate and control the economics, the behavior, the choices, even the parenting of their partner. And so providing information and then providing hotline information and cautioning people about safety, and then assuring them that it's really up to them what they choose to do, because they know better than anyone else what is the safest thing. And one of the scary statistics is that battered women are most often killed just at the point where they are leaving or have left the relationship, because if everything is about power and control and the batterer thinks that they own the other person basically, or they want to own them, then they'd rather kill them than let someone else possess them. So exiting the relationship is something that has to be very carefully planned in advance and is not something that we can just insist upon because we don't know all of the dynamics of what's happening in that relationship. If my relationship is with the perpetrator, well, for one thing, he's not likely to, I'll say he, since that's the most likely. He's not likely to tell me that he's battering his partner. One of the key signs of intimate partner violence is that the perpetrator will minimize and deny and blame the victim. So supposing that I found out somehow that this person was abusing their partner, it would be very risky for me to confront them about that without having the full permission and knowledge of the victim, because confronting that person could set off a chain of retaliation toward the victim. If someone sincerely came to me and told me that they were concerned because they had lost their temper, and by the way, it's not usually about losing one's temper, it's about a strategy of power and control in which violence is a part. But if they came to me and they admitted that they had used physical violence in their relationship, I would express concern and care, and I would tell them that there are groups of men who are trying to work together to end violence in their own lives, and I would make a referral to one of those groups. There are anger management organizations which go part of the way, but because the underlying dynamic is not just anger, but power and control, I don't recommend going to anger management only. I recommend going to one of these groups. You can find them on the domestic violence websites for your area, your geographical area. Peer groups, just like with addiction, peer groups are the best way for men to recognize the extent of their violence, because even when people want to seek help, they sometimes still deny and minimize. If you're with a group of people who do the same thing as you, they can call you on your BS and they can hold you accountable. The best of these groups are facilitated by people who also stay closely in touch with battered women's organizations to hold the whole organization accountable. Connect in New York City is the group that I know best currently. Man Alive in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, several others around the country. They're not as easy to find as battered women's organizations, but they do exist and they can provide resources. But I wouldn't try to counsel the man by myself, because even some of the best therapists who aren't trained in domestic violence can be manipulated, because part of the pattern of a classic batterer is to be highly manipulative. Dr. Catherine Jackson, thank you for your comment. Yes, there's so many forms of DV, not just physical. Sometimes the other forms leave more scars internally than the physical ones. Yes, many battered women and others in abusive relationships will say that the emotional damage is some of the hardest to undo later. Lucille, if you know someone or child is being abused, what is a good way to get them to open up? Well, child abuse is a bit of a different situation. With child abuse, if you're a therapist, you're a mandated reporter. And I also think that those of us in leadership in religious communities also have a moral obligation to report child abuse. But let me say that there are ways of going about that will maintain relationship better than some other ways. I am very much against anonymous reporting, because I think anonymous reporting does not empower the victim, or in the case of a child where the parent isn't the abuser, doesn't give the parent an option to discuss what's best. My number one preference is to get the child, if the child is at least a teenager, or the parent, if the parent is not one of the abusers, to make the report. And I would want to be present with that person when they make the report, or to talk to them about making the report and verify that it happened. And the lever I have there is to say, you know, I have to report, but it would be better if you do it yourself, because you know the whole situation. That preserves relationship as opposed to betraying a confidence as they might see it. Or in the situation where some agencies of child abuse, governmental agencies are underfunded and understaffed, there can be mistakes made, and you don't want to make things worse. And this is particularly true, again, in communities of color and also immigrant communities. So to do the reporting in partnership is very important. How to get a child to open up is really not our domain, because once a disclosure is made, it's very important that, non-experts not, in a sense, contaminate the field of evidence by asking a lot of questions, especially leading questions which can actually harm the child later if anything goes to court. So it's best to say, I really am very, very concerned about this. I know that it might be hard for you, but I think we need to make a report about this so that you can get the help that you need. A phrase that I borrowed from a good friend of mine who's a family therapist is, we need to widen the circle of care. So without trying to get more details out of the child, to bring the parent, the trusted parent in if you can, or to make the report with the child together. In the case of some immigrant and refugee communities, I have also found it necessary to bring in a community leader of that community who can support the process. That all of what I'm saying, of course, means that you need to be networking deeply in the various communities that are in your congregation. And there again, I wouldn't push a victim of adult family violence to disclose more to me than they want to, because I want to keep them in control of the entire process. So I can provide information, and very often that does create a conversation back and forth where the person will share more. But I'm not necessarily the person as the pastor who needs to know more. The person who needs to know more is the victim, and then the victim needs to activate a network of social support, organizational support, legal support that will help them to be safe. Other questions? You can see, it's delicate, it's tricky, but the bottom line is we want to empower all victims to be as active in their own healing and safety as possible. And we don't want to disempower them by taking over that process ourselves. And I think, clergy, sometimes we think we need to be all things to all people, and we have a little bit of a rescue complex sometimes, but we actually will do more harm than good if we don't widen that circle of care and allow those who are really experts in to work together with us. Are there other questions or comments? Well, if not, let me put my email address in the chat. And I welcome you to contact me privately if you would like to continue the conversation or ask another question. I do want to recommend the two books that I've written on this subject, which go into a lot more detail than I was able to do today. The Cry of Tamar, 2nd edition, Fortress Press, 2012, and Gender, Violence, and Justice. That is Cascade, Width and Stock, 2017. Those will give you a lot more statistics, and of course the Faith Trust Institute in Seattle, which has lots and lots of resources online that you can look at. Anybody else? All right, well, I thank you for your attention. I thank you for turning out for this topic, which is not an easy topic, and it's one that we in the churches need to pay a lot of attention to. And I hope that you are well, and I look forward to any further questions you might have if you want to email me. Thank you so much.